Good evening, folks. Well done for making it. What a day again today in Bournemouth. Marvellous. Faith in the future. That's where we're headed tonight in this extraordinary chapter in the book of Daniel, chapter 2. Let's begin, though, by just looking at a few of the most iconic images of the last 25 years. They've all got something in common. Here's the first, November the 9th, 1989. Some of you too young to remember this, but that was the symbol of the collapse of communism, the falling of the Berlin Wall, which had divided East and Western Germany for so long. Who would have believed until that point, or just before, that the Iron Curtain power blocks would crumble? Then there was 9/11. You know, that very date is synonymous with an event that changed everything, changed perspective at every level. The great symbol of capitalism, the World Trade Center, the cathedral of materialism in the most powerful country in the world, was reduced to rubble within hours. And less than 2 years later, and some would argue because of 9/11, the invasion of Iraq and the fall of Saddam Hussein on April the 9th, 2003, well, at least the destruction of his bronze image in Paradise Square, Baghdad. The actual fall of the Hussein regime was a few weeks later, but his image came crashing down, do you remember? And people danced and shouted and celebrated the end of Saddam. Now, each of those images has in common a single truth. And I think it's the truth at the heart of Daniel chapter 2, that all human empires will come to dust. That all civilizations and ideas, no matter how powerful or noble, are destined for the landfill of history. The human story is littered with the relics and remains of those who thought they could master the world. Alexander the Great, Caesar, Napoleon, Stalin, Chairman Mao, and the king to whom we're introduced in the opening chapters of this prophecy of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar. He was to discover, like all the others, that he had feet of clay, and that his empire was but for a day. Who was Nebuchadnezzar? Well, Nebuchadnezzar was the 6th century BC emperor whose rule, if we look at the map, stretched from Egypt in the west to its capital Babylon in the east. That's modern-day Iraq. And in 605, when the narrative of the book of Daniel begins, Nebuchadnezzar was at the height of his powers. He was lord of all he surveyed, the richest, the most powerful man on earth, the architect of one of the most advanced cultures in history, and yet the creator of a brutal regime, which involved the destruction and subjugation of countries like Judah, from which Daniel, our hero, came. You see, it was the emperor's policy to deport the brightest and best minds of his conquered territories. And that, of course, brings Daniel and his friends to Nebuchadnezzar's royal court, and under the influence of Babylon's university education. It was there, as we saw last week, that Daniel proved himself to be the intellectual and physical superior of all his contemporaries. And because of his remarkable achievement, Daniel came to the king's attention as someone who, in every matter of wisdom and understanding, was 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Yet Daniel, through his great rise to fame, never compromised his faith in God. And it was those two things, his unswerving loyalty to God on the one hand, and his ability to be of use to the king, which sets up the scene for chapter 2. And verse 1, in the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he couldn't sleep. You see, for all his power, Nebuchadnezzar was deeply insecure. Perhaps that's the reason for the dream the king forgot. We read on in verse 2. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Dreams are strange things, aren't they? If we shared the content of some of our dreams with other people, they'd probably want to certify us. But in the ancient world, dreams were believed to carry messages from the gods. Poor Nebuchadnezzar. Apparently, the gods had so got through to him that he couldn't remember what they'd said. He'd forgotten his dream, or maybe he pretended to have forgotten the dream in order to make sure who he could trust in the royal courts of Babylon. Anyhow, the repressed fears of Nebuchadnezzar's subconscious haunt his dream world at night. His mind is troubled. Insomnia strikes. And it's rather ironic. You see, in the second year of his reign, at the height of his powers, in only the second year of what would turn out to be a very long 47-year reign, the king was already paranoid, worried about his name and his status. Like so many tyrants and rulers and presidents before and after him, his successful exterior hid a very deep insecurity. For Nebuchadnezzar's empire, like his ego, was large but fragile. Now this is not just an issue for the rich and for the famous. When anyone makes power or wealth or status or possessions the basis of their life, the source of their identity, they will often worry. Do I have enough? How do I keep what I've got? You see, for such people, enough is never enough. Clothes are never fashionable enough. Cars are never fast enough. Houses never big enough. And those who climb the ladder of success will often get to the top and realize it's leaning against the wrong wall. Nebuchadnezzar is not at peace with the world because he is not at peace with himself. And according to verse 2, the king works out his insecurities, his anxieties, on these specialist advisors in psychic phenomena. The enchanters, the magicians, the sorcerers and astrologers, the interpreters of dreams. He had, after all, housed them, he'd fed them, he'd looked after them. They owed him some peace of mind. So he goes to them. But as the narrative unfolds, all their wisdom fails. Because if they were going to help the king, then they needed some help first. So they go to him and say, King, tell us your dream. We can't do our job if you don't tell us your dream. Without the content, you see, they couldn't consult their dream manuals and their star charts to understand what was all going on in Nebuchadnezzar's mind. That's how their hocus pocus worked. But the king, he didn't trust anyone. So he plays hardball, doesn't he, in verse 5. This is what I firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. That was how Nebuchadnezzar and tyrants like him rule, by fear and brutality. All rivals eliminated, all potential traitors dispatched without trial. So Nebuchadnezzar thought that their repeated request, tell us your dream, O king, was in fact a delaying tactic, perhaps even a conspiracy. I am certain, verse 8, that you are trying to gain time because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. These poor astrologers and enchanters, they know they are beaten before they even start. And so they say in verse 10, King, there is not a man on earth who can do what you ask. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. What an uncomfortable truth for these enchanters and astrologers to realize. The paganism of Babylon has no answers for the future. Here are some of the wisest religious professionals in Nebuchadnezzar's empire, and they are completely in the dark. That is the bankruptcy of religion without the God of the Bible. Without the God of the Bible, religion can give no sure word from outside. It cannot speak with certainty. It has no secure hold on the future. Pagan religion is merely smoke and mirrors, keeping people in fear and superstition. You see, these wise men in Babylon know that only divine power could reveal to the king what he needed to know, and divine power is not available amongst men. Now, think about the audience to whom really Daniel's prophecy is being given and written. Those like Daniel himself who were in exile, far from home. They'd been ripped away from their homeland and were spending years in captivity in Babylon under the heel of Nebuchadnezzar's pagan, hostile culture, surrounded by a culture that was hostile to their faith. What a wonderful encouragement it was to be told through this story. Don't worry about the gods of Babylon. They are deaf and dumb and foolish. Don't be fooled by their apparent power and dominance. They are in fact weak and helpless. Come back to the narrative. It was in verse 13 the death threat issued upon the heads of all the wise men in Babylon for failure to help the king that brings, of course, Daniel and his friends directly into the drama. So, from the dream that had been forgotten, let's look secondly at the response that Daniel made. First, in verse 14, he takes a terrific risk. He goes to Arioch bravely. Arioch is the Lord High Executioner, put in charge of this death squad. And he asks Arioch for more time. Then he goes to his friends and asks them to pray. Listen to verse 18. He urged Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to plead for mercy from the God of heaven. Daniel knew where wisdom came from. His God. So that night, as his friends had prayed with him, all was revealed to Daniel. At which point, Daniel doesn't go rushing off to tell the king, notice. No, he stays where he is, and what? He worships God from verse 19. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his." And then his worship continues. And the content of this worship emphasizes some very important things. Firstly, that God rules over everything. Verse 21, God changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. And because God is in charge of history, he is able to reveal its meaning. For history is not shaped by impersonal forces, but by the personal God whom Daniel knows, the God of heaven. This God, secondly, also makes his ways known. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. The hallmark of pagan religions is superstition, ignorance, fear, and darkness. Whereas the hallmark of biblical faith is knowledge, freedom, and light. God, says Daniel, God tells us what we need to know. And he knows even what he doesn't tell us. He knows what lies in darkness. Now, to have a God who reveals mysteries does not mean we have a God who unveils everything. God doesn't show us which stocks and shares are going to do well in the coming months. God doesn't show us whether we will live to be 100, whether we will have a job next year. No, God only reveals what we need to know. He himself knows what is yet unknown in the darkness, as Daniel describes it. My friends, we can walk into the future with a God like that. The God who assures us that even though we have many personal uncertainties, we have a God who knows what's to come and will be with us. Listen, you don't need to know everything when God does. So you can move forward in hope and without fear. That was the response that Daniel made. Thirdly, from verse 24 to 45, and Kezia didn't read this, it's a long chapter. Thirdly, we have the dream explained. There it is centrally in verse 31. Can you find 31 in your Bibles? You looked, O king, here's Daniel talking to the great emperor himself. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. The king's dream was a terrifying one. There it was out in the desert somewhere, a colossal statue, both impressive but also vulnerable. For though this colossus was made of a gold head and strong silver chest and arms and bronze stomach and thighs, its instability lay in its legs, which were part iron and part clay. But that, says Daniel, was not the reason for its downfall. He goes on in verse 34. While you were watching, O king, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. You see, it was this stone which, having destroyed the statue, then grew into a mountain and filled the whole earth, that is the significant winner in the king's dream. We have no idea from the text whether Nebuchadnezzar recognized the young man who stood before him, but there is no doubt that the emperor recognized the dream and the interpretation that Daniel gave to him of it. You see, the king knew this. In his ambition, he had sought to make himself and his empire an impregnable giant, towering over the world. Says Daniel to him in verse 37, You, O king, are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. You are that head of gold. Yet his glorious kingdom would, as he feared, it would not last. The little phrase in verse 39, after you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there'll be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. After you, great as he is, neither Nebuchadnezzar or his empire will live forever. For after him, 3 more great empires would come and go. Now, in the commentaries, there's some debate about what empires exactly the parts of the statue beneath the golden head actually represent. Probably the Persian Empire that followed soon after Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian Empire, then the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great, and finally the Roman Empire. But what is clear is that all these man-made kingdoms would give way. They will not last. Listen to verse 44. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom, says Daniel to Nebuchadnezzar, a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This, O king, is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. In other words, the fall of this colossus in the sands of time was part of something far bigger than the Babylonian, than the Persian, than the Greek or the Roman Empire. It was part of something that the God of heaven was doing. The stone mountain would triumph over them all, outlasting every power, every rule and empire. For this king and his kingdom is everlasting. Now, before I nail the key lessons from this chapter, let's complete the narrative from verses 46 to 49. The God of Daniel acknowledged. When Daniel reveals the dream and its interpretation to his master, King Nebuchadnezzar, the king honors Daniel's God as the number one revealer of mysteries. Listen to the postscript in verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. The God of Daniel acknowledged, but don't be fooled by the king's response. This is no lasting spiritual makeover. This is no transforming encounter with God on Nebuchadnezzar's part. No, the next 2 chapters make it very clear that Nebuchadnezzar the king is not a changed man. All he's doing there is expressing his relief that he's still the head of gold. So he makes room, big of him, for one more God in his personal temple. The king's response was also, of course, to honor Daniel. He appoints him at the very end of the chapter, the chief of staff in his empire, second only to the emperor himself. And then Daniel's friends are selected as provincial administrators in Babylon. That's the chapter. Let's see now in the wrap-up if we can draw out some major lessons. And I want to do this by asking a few key questions. Firstly, who is really in charge of the world? That was the great question that the people of Israel were asking as they tried to make sense of the fact that they were a conquered nation, far from home, in exile. All that they had built their lives upon had disappeared. They were without a home, without a nation, without a temple. They were in captivity. Were they also without their God? And in the commentary of this chapter, Daniel is surely telling them and us, they are not to mistake the fall of Jerusalem for the fall of God. Were the gods of Babylon in charge, therefore? No. The best of Babylonian wisdom and religion was unable to help the troubled king. They left him in the dark. They had no answers. Only the God of Daniel was in charge of the unknown future. To him, to this God, the future is an open book. He controls the movements of times, the rise and fall of nations. Was this great and terrible emperor really in charge? No. Look at the narrative. Nebuchadnezzar is not in charge of his own sleep patterns, let alone his empire. He is finite. His life will end, but not this God who reveals the deep and hidden things, not this God of heaven whose kingdom will endure. Yeah, like Nebuchadnezzar's statue in the desert, Saddam's image fell. It's the story of all human leaders and empires. Human leaders may think that they are in charge of their own destiny, but they know deep down in their dreams that that's a lie. They dread the nightmare, which says in the words of verse 39, after you, another kingdom will rise. After you. It is the statement that every tyrant dreads. After you. One of the fiercest opponents of the Christian church in the first few centuries was the Roman Emperor Julian. However, during one battle, he was mortally wounded in a war with the Persians. And while Julian's expedition was in progress, one of his followers, equally hostile to the Christian faith, asked the Christian what Jesus, whom the hostile interrogator dismissively called the carpenter's son, what he was doing. The Christian replied, the maker of the world, whom you call the carpenter's son, is employed in making a coffin for the emperor. You see, that's the lesson of Daniel chapter 2. Jesus has a coffin for every empire and emperor. And therefore, the only security is to belong to the kingdom of the carpenter's son. I say again, who's really in charge of the universe? Maybe in our battles at work, or in wider society, or in college, it's very easy to think that God is not in control, that he's outmaneuvered and outflanked by the ideas and powers of the 21st century. Let me tell you this, through you, through every believing Christian disciple, God is taking on the false gods of this world. Every time you share the good news about Jesus, God is saying that he is still alive, that he's still in control, that he's still able to turn people from their idols to find security and significance in him. That's the first question. Who's really in charge? Here's the second. Can God really be known? That's another key issue of this chapter. Is it possible to live secure and without fear of the future? Is there a God who speaks? That was the great conundrum for the astrologers and enchanters in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. By their own admission, the wise men worshipped idols and practiced a religion that did not give them access to such knowledge. As they said to the king, for the gods do not live among men. They do not speak to men. But not Daniel's God. He is different. He is not hidden, but alive and active in the world. The God of the Bible is constantly acting and speaking to the people of his world. He does so because he's a God who loves relationship and seeks them with those whom he has made. And the place where we see God most visibly communicating with his world is in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. For in Jesus, God speaks with compelling clarity. God lives among men and walks among men and transforms us. Third question, what about human authority? Is there such a thing as human authority? Well, in verse 37, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, "You, O king, are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory in your hands, O king. He has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You have been given authority, Nebuchadnezzar." You see, the source of Nebuchadnezzar's power was the God of heaven. All human authority comes from God and carries that significance. And for Daniel, it meant that he was therefore not to lead a campaign of civil disobedience, much less plot the king's downfall. No, he was to recognize the emperor's right to rule, even when his own life was at risk. Daniel was honoring God's structures within society by honoring the king. Now, if you know the story of Daniel, you'll know that the time will come in chapter 3, the next chapter, and chapter 6, when Daniel puts his foot down and has to obey God rather than the king. But at the end of chapter 2, as at the end of chapter 1, we see Daniel and his friends serving the king, taking up major roles in this hostile society, fully immersing themselves in the culture. What might this mean for us? Well, at a very basic level, it means that we obey the state insofar as we can. We pay our taxes. We keep the highway code. We're good citizens and neighbors and colleagues. And like Daniel, we enter into the host culture and we live as disciples of Jesus there. Final question of this chapter. Is there a future? Is there a future? There was perhaps no more important question for Daniel's generation than that. You see, they had lost everything. The future must have looked pretty bleak to them. One of the extraordinary things about what prophets like Ezekiel and Daniel did was to transform the outlook of their generation, to give God's people a vision of and hope in the future. And Nebuchadnezzar's dream was one way of making the point. For according to Nebuchadnezzar's dream, a kingdom would arise to whom the future belonged. A kingdom, says Daniel, not made by human hands. A kingdom that would break into the midst of world affairs with irresistible power and ever-growing strength. The kingdom of the God of heaven. And Daniel saw this kingdom coming down the tracks of history. Beyond Babylon, beyond Persia, beyond Rome. And if you're still here in a few weeks' time when we get to chapter 7, you'll see how Daniel perceives that coming kingdom with even greater clarity. And of course, generations later, when Caesar Augustus ruled the world, that kingdom of God arrived in Jesus. For in the words and works of the carpenter's son, God was doing something new, something unique. So, Nebuchadnezzar, you are not the King of Kings. The future does not belong to you. That title belongs to another, to Jesus. And his memorial is not a ruined statue out in the desert. No, the memorial of Jesus is an empty cross. And Jesus' body is not encased in a mausoleum somewhere. Jesus is risen and glorified. And one day, Jesus will return as our glorious King, and every eye shall see him, and every knee will bow to him. It seems to me that one of the very prevailing moods that dominates our culture and society today, particularly amongst the young, is a sense of hopelessness about the future. I meet people over and over again who are basically giving up on the future. They are skeptical, they are disillusioned, they don't know whose promises to trust anymore. Not the politicians. Politics has no more dreams, only nightmares. Not the scientists, not the financiers, not the military. No, education, technology, science has not produced utopia. And the current generation, more than any other, has become pessimistic and disillusioned and skeptical with all authorities. You see, for many people, the future of Earth is very dark and bleak. It hangs beneath the holes in the ozone layer and waits for global catastrophe. It holds its breath as nations play nuclear hide-and-seek with each other. What we need, what our world needs, is a dream of the future which the Christian faith distinctively provides. For Christians are people of hope. And in a society like ours, which is growing increasingly pessimistic and apathetic, Christians should stand out a mile. For our hope is based upon God's promise to us in Jesus, and in that kingdom that will triumph forever. And so we are to live our lives as children of the future, dancing to its music, for the King will come, and he will bring his kingdom in. And all the nations of the world will bow, and all the rulers of the ages will recognize who is the King of Kings. And it's our great privilege as disciples of Jesus to know what the future is going to look like and to follow the one who will make all things possible. Well, as we sing our closing song, let's reflect upon that great reality that though there's darkness and injustice and oppression and fear, God has sent Jesus as our King, the one who will return, and therefore we live and pray for his return. Come, Lord Jesus.